come away with Spain. We come away from Spain happy, praising God. The fall of Granada, this beautiful piece of music, classical music, there's no lament in it. It's joy. It's joy. Celebrate. The tears become roses. We still have our faith. We have the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is the way that we go back to our country, and of course we have to build. But one of the things you see, of course, is the immense staying power that our faith has. Incredible staying power. But another thing too is that what happened with the Mudejars and the Moriscos is that in both cases, systematically, their infrastructures were destroyed. This is especially true of the Moriscos. With the Mudejars, it depends, and the Mudejar communities vary. The Mudejars of Abdal, of Navarre, those had the best conditions of all. The Mudejars of Aragon also had a pretty good situation. Castile also. The Mudejars of Alqueria in the south, these had a lot of problems, for many reasons that we won't go into. But among the Moriscos, the infrastructure was totally decimated. Endowments, imams, the imams were the worst punished people in the Inquisition. So that ultimately the Mudejars to some extent and the Moriscos almost totally become people without leaders, a workforce. That's all they were. They were field hands and workforce. Because they're very good workers, they're very good farmers. And then also the Inquisition pitted them against each other, so that when you are proving that you are a sincere Christian in the Inquisition, you have to turn somebody in. Because obviously, you know that there are people out there who are crypto-Muslims. And so often, tribes that are angry with each other or have feuds or hate each other, they turn each other in, or maybe a wife turns in her husband who beats her. You know, or other things happen like that. In any case, this divided the community. I want to just point this out because we in America, you know, mashallah, tabarakallah, we have incredibly good circumstances, and especially in Chicago. And we must be thankful for this. And it's one of the great blessings of God that Johnson's amendment of the Immigration Act in 1965 caused a brain drain in the Muslim world. We apologize. But it brought brains to the United States, many of whom are sitting right here. So we have per capita the most educated Muslim community on earth. We have one of the most wealthy per capita on earth, although we have many problems in our community, many poor people, many uneducated people. But we still have a very exceptional community. And as Sayyid Hussein Nasr has said, may God bless him, that we may be the most important Muslim minority in history. We have the chance to do something. And yet, right now, we are like Moriscos. Not because we're oppressed, but because we have no infrastructure. We have no institutions. We have no leaders. I don't mean we don't have any at all, but what I mean is that we don't have sufficient. And we must build these things. We must create elites. And you look here, when you see the remnants of Muslim Spain, what you've seen everywhere. I mean, these were sophisticated people. And the Ottoman Turks were sophisticated people. And the Moguls and Muslims, wherever they were in China, what we saw in China. So, and you are sophisticated people. And we must create a sophisticated infrastructure of people, scholars, knowledgeable people, and then gradually build up that thing, which in the case of the Moriscos, once it was destroyed, they could never do anything. And then finally, just one last point. When the Jews were destroyed in Iberia, the Muslims were destroyed. And this is something that historians, I think, may agree with. I know some of them insist upon it. Once the Jews went, the Muslims were free to go. Because, and we talked about the nature of pluralism, the presence of the Jewish see how the same Palace of the Lion is built like a cloister. You're combining Christian and Jewish and Muslim elements. But when the Jews went, the Muslims had no hope. And what does this mean for us? It means for us that we must be very intelligent in our politics. And we must understand that pluralism is a shared interest that we must defend. And if you look back to the last election, when certain people, motivated by political interests that have nothing to do with the United States, nothing to do with the Muslims of the United States, got us to vote for Bush because they thought he would benefit the Palestinian cause. And what kind of a mistake was this? Whereas our interests have got to be with the needy and the oppressed and the minorities, the Hispanics and the African Americans, even if we are wealthy, even if we live in suburbia, even if we want not to pay taxes. I didn't expect that. I'm not trying to, rhetoric. But in any case, as the next elections approach and African Americans are considering what they're going to do about the Democratic Party, then I believe we've got to take an interest in those things. Don't let other people make the decisions based on considerations elsewhere. And we support the Muslims everywhere. This is not to condemn any cause anywhere, but we have our interests, and those must come first. And our political interest in the United States is definitely with the civil rights movement and everything that stands with it. Whether you agree with it or not, that is your ally. And one of the things that was great about Muhammad Alexander Russell Weldon, God bless him, about whom I'm writing a book, this early Anglo-American Muslim, is that he understood things like that. So he aligned himself with the Buddhist Americans, the Buddhist converts, with the Unitarians, with anyone, the Transcendentalists, anyone who would support his cause. وأقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم والسلام عليكم.
Demonstrate their presence quite irrefutably. the Inquisition records dealing with the history of Jewish suffering under the Inquisitors have been raked over many times by brilliant historians, and we know that story. But there are very few Muslims in the US or in Europe who have really looked at the suffering of Muslims under the Inquisition, and particularly in the New World. As far as I know, there is no good Muslim historian who has looked at the records in Mexico City and in Lima and Guatemala and elsewhere in order to fill out what is still a very skeletal picture. It might help to situate this to Muslim eyes rather weird institution if we recall that Christianity, Western Christianity, in its developed Latin Catholic form, has a structure of authority that is very different to that familiar to Muslims, and one that tends and has tended to lead more to institutionalized persecution than in the case of mainstream Islam. There really has never been a Muslim equivalent of the Spanish Inquisition. One reason for this is, I think, that there is no irreducible hierarchy of authority in Sunni Islam that can remotely parallel the situation in developed Catholicism. There is a kind of hierarchy of authority in that there are madahib, there are ulama, there are muftis, there are qadis, but it's not an institution as rigorous and with its boundaries as narrowly defined as in Latin Christianity. That was one reason. Secondly, Islam has also doctrinally, and here Abdul Hakim Jackson's work is very timely, had a kind of instinctual urge to draw the circle of legitimate belief as widely as possible, rather than as narrowly as possible. And Imam al-Ghazali is a particularly clear example of that. So we get in the great Ghazalian empire, such as the Ottoman Empire, an urge on the part of the qadis and the muftis really not to try and embody for aberrant religious practice unless it's associated with some kind of really dangerous political solution. Trials for heresy in the Ottoman Empire are quite unusual. And another factor, I think, is the point that Dr. Umar has mentioned, which is that the church really was in a state of almost panic regarding the facility with which people became Muslim, given half the chance, and the extreme difficulty of pushing them from Islam into Christianity. So in Islamic history, there has never really been a problem over suspecting the sincerity of converts. We know that the greatest cities of medieval Christianity converted to Islam over a period of several hundred years, and there was never an extensive anxiety amongst the authorities of the Fuqaha about the sincerity of those conversions, about their loyalties should war once again break out with Byzantium. That was not a problem for the Muslims. The conversions were very quick, very systematic, they were unforced, and it's extremely unusual to find people, for instance, heading for Byzantine territory because they've changed their mind. Occasionally in the late Ottoman period, you get Christian villages in Albania that become Muslim, and then will swing back to Christianity again after the Ottoman tide has receded. The other major area for this is in India, where over the period of centuries, villages might swing backwards and forth between Hinduism and Islam, and there are a number of documented cases of that. But generally, for high classical Islamic civilization, you didn't need anything like an Inquisition, because the sincerity of converts was unquestioned. Persecution in the Latin context predates the Inquisition, because it's essentially the 13th to 14th century institution in its foundations. Generally, trials for heresy and aberrant practices were left to individual bishops and the ecclesiastical courts. But after the Crusades take place, when Christianity starts to develop a much more militant self-definition, when it starts to have Muslims under its authority in Spain, because the wars in Spain were considered to be crusades and were led by crusading orders like the Knights of Calatrava, and there was a very close psychological parallelism between the war in Palestine and the war on Al-Andalus. And also because of certain heresies that erupted in southern France, particularly the Albigensian heresy, which had to be put down with extreme brutality mutilations of the Albigensians in order to suppress their heresy. It became much more systematic and had to be institutionalized in a way that became one of the tributaries that flow into the whole shaping, not just of European ecclesiological culture, but of political culture as well. We know, for instance, that Russia's self-definition and Russia's approach to minorities, whether it be Jewish minorities, or Muslim minorities, or even Buddhist minorities, was explicitly shaped by the Inquisition. The advisors to Peter the Great, for instance, said, let's look at what the Spaniards have done to deal with their minorities, and we can use this. And part of the tradition of Russian autocracy and centralization and totalitarianism, which of course had enormous repercussions for the shape of the 20th century, also goes back to the Spanish Inquisition. One could say similar things about Germany with its idea of the crusade towards the east and subjugating subject populations. As another case in point, after all, the Teutonic Knights called the pagan Prussians and Lithuanians the Saracens of the North. Anyway, that's just to indicate the importance of this institution. The key date that triggers all this is 20th of April 1233, when a Pope, Gregory IX, issues a bull that gives the Dominican order of monks the duty of monitoring and ending heresy. As Dr. Umar mentioned, no person would never be baptized could be officially persecuted. But if you had accepted baptism, even if it had been at the point of the sword, then any backsliding or discreet practice of older non-Christian traditions would have to be suppressed by force. And St. Dominic is the key figure here because he really had led the shock troops of the Catholic Church in the Albigensian crusade against the Cathars, the dualists of southern France. Another important date is 1252, when the Pope for the first time sanctions the use of torture as part of the Inquisition method. And from this date also we get some of the key aspects of Inquisition procedure, such as secret evidence. Think John Ashcroft here. Secret evidence, sealed dossiers as they put it. Secret evidence, also the presumption of guilt, fundamental principle of the Inquisition court, and no defense counsel. It does sound remarkably familiar. Another important aspect of the Inquisition was that part of its efficiency and its extraordinary wealth was that it maintained itself by the confiscation of property. So the Inquisitors themselves had an interest in securing convictions. Its imposition really begins in Aragon, partly because that's where some of the Albigensians had lived. But the major problem of crypto-Muslims and crypto-Jews appears in Castile, and it's really in Castile that the Spanish Inquisition gathers momentum. 1474, Queen Isabella in Seville takes the next step. She hears a sermon from one of the Dominican priors by the name of Alonso de Ojeda, who denounces crypto-Muslims and crypto-Jews, people who are going to church and eating bacon for breakfast, but in fact, secretly behind closed doors, they're practicing Judaism or practicing Islam. And he says these people insincerely convert in order to subvert Christianity from within. They pretend to be good citizens, they're obeying our religious practices, but in secret they're a fifth column. So two individuals, certain Pedro González, who's the Archbishop of Seville, and Tomás de Torquemada, who is another Dominican from Segovia, start to create mechanisms. They persuade the Catholic kings, Ferdinand and Isabella, that this needs to be integrated into the political systems of Spain. And they also write to the Pope asking him for a new papal bull. And on the 1st of November 1478, Pope Sixtus IV authorizes this, and the Inquisition proper, as a unified institution, begins in Seville. So it develops in close tandem with the development of a unified Spanish monarchy. 1481 sees the first successful executions. These are 6 leading citizens of Seville who are convicted of practicing Islam secretly. They walk barefoot with unlighted candles from the Triana prison to the cathedral, where they have to attend Mass and a sermon. This is the building that we visited. And then they were burnt at the stake. And the burnings became so frequent that often outside Spanish towns, a stone platform called the quemadero was erected, and would be directly there. That's where these executions would take place, at the hands of what the Arabs called the harabun. The Arabic word for the Inquisitors was the harabun, the burners, literally. 1482, the Inquisition grows in size. Torquemada gets more resources, and he establishes tribunals in every major Spanish city. It's not just in Seville, but it's throughout the dominions of the Catholic monarchs. The separate inquisitions are in 1488 finally united as the Consejo de la Suprema y General Inquisición under Torquemada as the Inquisitor General. We still don't know, because the records are extremely rich and extremely extensive and haven't been properly mapped. We don't know how many people were involved, but to give one example, and to later has been particularly well studied, between 1485 and 1500, 250 people were burned in the city of Toledo. Who were the Inquisitors themselves? They were highly educated priests. They had to have university training in law and theology. And they had under them a kind of police force called the familiars, who were laymen in black garments that would bear the white cross of St. Dominic. It was considered an honour to be a familiar of the Inquisition. It was often sought out by the nobility for their sons. Beneath them, there was a huge network of stool pigeons in prisons, informers, and spies. But quite a lot of denunciations were unsolicited, as Dr. Umar mentioned, by jealous neighbours and others who wished to see their neighbours or husbands arrested. Often parish priests were involved on the local level. It was quite typical in an ethnically mixed or religiously mixed area for the parish priest to be the principal officer of the Inquisition in the area. And he would visit outlying places, small hamlets, settlements, and demand that any information about local heretics be supplied. If anybody had heard something that suggested that so-and-so was not in secret a good Christian, that information would be solicited. It was considered sufficient proof of guilt for there to be the testimony of two witnesses, and those witnesses usually were not disclosed. Their identity was kept secret. Records were kept in case of future relapses, and this is one reason why the Inquisition archives are such an immensely rich source of information. In some areas, when the Inquisition was finally closed down in the 19th century, the records were burnt. I believe this happened in Goa and some other places. But generally in Europe and the Americas, they were conserved. Even statements elicited under torture were preserved. It was a very efficient machine, but typically very slow, because there was an immense backlog of cases. They had to inquire about so many people. Sometimes the prisoner might remain for years in his cell before being visited by the priest to sort his confession. The house searches focused on the absence of pork. That was regarded as a sure sign of guilt, and also evidence of unusual hygiene, and also Muslim methods of slaughter. In prison itself, during this period, various forms of torture were used, even outside the formal practices of interrogation. There was something called the kiri amigo, which was an iron fork which was locked to the chin of the prisoner and his head erect. The prisoner had no access to family. If he was caught speaking to other prisoners, he would be gagged for fear that he might spread heresy. Again, the paranoia of the authorities about the ability of Islam to spread even in desperate situations. And it came to be standard practice for prisoners of the Inquisition to be kept in solitary confinement for this reason. Interrogation, when finally the case came to trial, and there would be an interrogation, and the room would have all of its walls draped with black fabric, over the walls and the windows as well. The Inquisitors would sit behind a table wearing white robes and black hoods. Their faces, therefore, would not be seen. And if a prisoner solemn oath never to speak of anything that he'd seen and heard. If repeated interrogation didn't produce a confession, the prisoner would be taken to another room, his clothes would be removed, and he would be shown the instruments of torture. The Inquisitors themselves, as priests, would not engage in torture, but they would be present together with a scribe and a physician. A number of methods of torture were used. Possibly the most common was called the garrocha. The prisoner would have his hands tied behind his back and would then be hoisted by the hands by a pulley, which was then repeatedly jerked. Another method was called a taka. The prisoner would be tied to a wooden table, and a rag would be inserted into his mouth, which would be slowly dampened, which would have the effect of suffocating the victim. A number of other methods, including Mubaraka, were frequently used. There were no exceptions to this. Women and children were also recurrently subjected to torture. Children, because it was known that they would talk about the religious loyalties of their parents. The only concession was that pregnant women were allowed to sit while being tortured. Now, the problem was that the confession which was extracted under torture was regarded as having no legal weight. It all had to be repeated again before the tribunal itself. The death penalty was by no means always imposed. There was a variety of lesser punishments which were inflicted. For instance, one could be commanded to fast one day each week for a specified number of years as a penance, or wear any kind of halter in church. Other punishments included flogging. Sometimes people would be sentenced to the galleys. Sometimes they would be banished. Quite often they would be required to wear a penitential garment called the San Benito, which was a sackcloth tunic, which had to be worn whenever one left the house. And when one had finally expiated one's sins, then the tunic would be hung in one's local church to remind everybody that one had been condemned by the Inquisition. The supreme penalty was known as relaxation, which was being turned over to the government to be burned. And the idea behind this was to allow the church to avoid breaking the commandment, thou shalt not kill. The church itself did not execute, but they would sentence, and then the secular authorities would carry out the execution. It seems from the archives that the majority of people who were burned were actually burned in effigy. They had fled, they had gone to North Africa, or they had gone underground in hiding with relatives somewhere, and so a statue representing them, a wooden effigy, would be burnt instead. Sometimes also those who were posthumously condemned would be exhumed and their bodies would be burned. The auto de fe was the public ceremony in which this exemplary punishment was made manifest to the European population. By the middle of the 16th century, this became a kind of public pageant. Typically it was held on Sundays or on feast days, on saints' days, in order to ensure large crowds. The night before the burning, the accused would be told that they were going to be burnt. Two priests were sent to them, and if they repented sincerely, they could be strangled before actually being burned. Sunrise, the prisoners would be assembled in the main hall of the prison and would have their arms tied, and they would then follow in procession a large green cross and a file of the familiars. After the familiars would come the priest who was going to say Mass. He was carried on a throne under a big red-grilled canopy. And because he carried the sanctified communion wafers, everybody who saw the procession would be required to kneel. And again, quite often people who were controlled the Inquisition were those who were seen not to kneel as the priest passed. Those who had been condemned to death would wear black San Benitos covered with pictures of devils and representations of various infernal torments. After them would come the statues of those who had been sentenced in absentia, who the Inquisition couldn't physically get its hands on. And finally would be the bodies of those who had been dug up in order to be publicly burnt. And after them would come the Inquisitors themselves, who would be holding banners of red silk. Reaching the square, the condemned would sit on the ground or on black benches where they would hear Mass and the sermon. And then the priests would turn them over to the secular arm. Prisoners would be taken to the stake, the San Benitos would be taken off and would be hung in parish churches, and a local dignitary would be given the honour of lighting the fire. both Spain and Portugal's surviving Muslim and Jewish populations, the frequency of these auto-da-fe events progressively declined. In the middle of the 16th century in Toledo, sentences averaged almost one a day. 2 centuries later, only half a dozen were taking place in an entire year. By that time, the focus was very much on Protestantism, on forms of sexual misconduct. And it seems that the very last person in Spain to be burnt alive was a certain Maria de los Dolores Lopez, who had claimed to have had unauthorized visions of the Virgin Mary. She was burned in 1781, seems to be the last case. And then, of course, as we had in Madrid, Napoleon's occupation of Spain, the conscription of the familiars brought various catastrophes to the Inquisition's power and status. Napoleon collapses in 1815, of course, and it's revived for a while, with the publication in Madrid of a new edict that again, 2 centuries after the expulsion, condemns Muslims and Jews, Protestants, and also now Enlightenment nationalists. But in 1834, Queen Maria Cristina abolishes it definitively. We heard in Seville how many of the monasteries, former monasteries that we saw were actually secularized in that period, and the destruction of the Inquisition authority took place in the same reign. Muslim experience of the Inquisition was that the Muslims experienced a series of broken promises. It was a little bit like the experience of the Native Americans faced with the white American onslaught. Treaties were made, often under duress, and to be broken shortly afterwards. In 1492, when this area in Granada finally capitulated, toleration was promised. But in 1499, the Mosque of Granada was turned into a church, and Cardinal Cisneros began the standard campaign of persecution. There were mass baptisms, and there are extraordinary stories about how the priest would hold up a mop and turn it to sprinkle the holy water over huge crowds of Moors who wished to escape punishment by ostensibly taking on Christianity. And they were forced to abandon not just the religion, but also their traditional customs, their traditional clothes, music, dances, diet, and so on. 1501 is the next step when a royal edict gives way to the cardinal's desire to burn every Arabic book that the church committed its hands on, which of course was a massive catastrophe for recent historians who wish to reconstruct the history of Muslim Spain. In 1502, Islam is prohibited formally in Castile, but not in Aragon, where in some areas they were still in the majority. The area we visited around Tarazona was one of those, and another was the area around Valencia. Nonetheless, the continued crypto-Muslim presence caused a good deal of resentment. One of the reasons for the final expulsion was, as we've seen, the despair that the church felt that these people would never sincerely become Christian. It had really failed. Another was that so many old Christians were going to the New World that the Muslims were actually increasing in strength numerically. The fact that this is an age of the great flourishing of monasticism meant that there were fewer young people to reproduce the real Christian population. The fact that Muslims didn't drink wine deprived local landowners and the state of an important form of revenue because wine was taxed. A number of solutions were proposed. One of them came from the Bishop of Segorbe, Martin Salvatierra, who said that the solution was simply to castrate everybody who was of Muslim origin, even if he was practicing Christianity. And others thought that they should simply be forbidden to marry. So you have this extraordinary situation of large areas of Spain where everybody is going to church, but secretly they don't believe a word of what's going on in the Mass. And although they will apparently accede to all of the sacraments of the church, the one they miss out is extreme unction. Uncle just died too quickly and we couldn't bring the priest in time. That was a very frequent situation. Circumcision continues, and this becomes a major instrument for the Inquisition of determining people's ancestry and affiliation. And of course in Bosnia, just 10 years ago, one way that they would sort out the people who would be executed from those who weren't was to see who had been circumcised. Similarly, burial customs were a certain Bartolome Sanchez, was guilty of bathing. That was the accusation. Found guilty of bathing, and he was sentenced to 3 years on the galleys for that. Another, a gardener by the name of Miguel Cañete, in 1606, was found guilty of washing while in the field. He also was sentenced. Muslims, another technique against them, had to keep their doors open on Fridays to prove that no worship was taking place. Everybody was gathering in the courtyard to pray collectively. And the hijab and the niqab were, of course, absolutely prohibited. A number of laws were introduced so that people of Muslim origin, for instance, were prohibited to cut their beards. Similarly, many people who were of Muslim origin were forced to wear a blue crescent on their right shoulder. All of this provoked a series of rebellions in 1567, 1568, the Al-Kharas revolt. Don Juan of Austria is mobilized, and there are many atrocities. I mentioned in the bus on the way out that we passed the town of Galera, it's about 20 minutes drive from south of here, where 2,500 inhabitants were all slaughtered, the entire population was wiped out, including babies, following the rebellion. It was put down to 1570, and the secret Muslims of the Granada province were dispersed in great caravans. They would walk in groups of 1,500, guarded by 200 soldiers each, in various destinations designated by the church. It's estimated that about a quarter of them died before reaching their destinations, and they were moved to small ghettos in various parts of Castile. There were racial rules, the limpieza de sangre, the hygiene of blood, was hugely important in Spain, because it was assumed that even if a great-great-grandfather was a Jew or a Moor, one's Christianity was necessarily suspect. So they could not hold high office, they could not become familiars of the Inquisition and so on. But nonetheless, Islam continues to hold on with extreme doggedness, and you have the final expulsions, 1609 to 1614. This is the final solution. A fleet of galleys is secretly prepared, and the Moriscos, about 300,000 of them, are rounded up and dumped on North African beaches. Some of them resist, some of them go to France, where they're arrested there, and then they're sent on to North Africa. But nonetheless, the Inquisition continues to find pockets of Muslims, and the last documented case of Muslims being discovered seems to be in 1728, just more than 100 years after the expulsion. The Spanish historian Inquisitors has documented from Inquisition archives that a group of wealthy families in Granada were successfully condemned for the practice of Islam. He wasn't able to determine what the punishment was, but it seems there were 200 or 300 Muslims in the Albaycin region of Granada in the early 18th century. This is only 100 years before, of course, the Inquisition is finally wound up. Again, as Dr. Umar said, the Inquisition records again and again insist that it's the women who are most stubborn and practice the religion most faithfully. They're the ones who typically keep up with things like the fast of Ramadan, often because their sphere is domestic, it's easier for them to practice the arkan away from prying eyes. Often illegal midwives and circumcisers, female circumcisers, are convicted. In Saragossa, for instance, the Inquisition complained that the reason why men refused to eat pork and bacon was for fear of their wives. That was in the records. And a consequence of all of this was that it was quite unusual for individuals to be tried. It was more common for whole families to be arrested and tried as a kind of group. So, in 1606, Maria Paez of Almagro, who was 19 years old, was arrested and tortured and confessed that her family was secretly practicing Islam. Her father refused to confess and he was burned. Her mother confessed and she was sentenced to life imprisonment. A very typical case of a whole family going to the Inquisition together. But there were some individual isolated cases where family members were not implicated. I'll give you one example. Leonor de Jesus was a woman born to a Muslim family in Granada in 1568. This is the year of the Abdal Hakim Rebellion, which spreads through much of southern Spain. In no Muslim worship took place, and no groups of these Moriscos were allowed to gather in any one place. Again, the fatwas and the famous one of 1563 that Umar referred to, Mufti al-Quran said, Allah is not concerned with your outward attitude but with the intention of your hearts. And if they tell you to denounce Muhammad, denounce him by word and love him at the same time in your heart. This is going on. In any case, Leonor, as a toddler, survived the walk to Seville. It's thought that she found work as she grew up of a menial nature to support herself. Yesterday we visited Murillo's house in Seville, and it's known that he had a slave who was of Muslim origin and must have lived in that house with him. The records indicated that she had married, but by 1604, at the age of 36, she was already a widow. And in this year, she took the immense risk of attempting to escape to North Africa on a boat with a group of other Moriscos. Just before embarking, she was caught by the familiars of the Inquisition. She was interrogated and tortured and threatened with a stake. She said that she would now be a sincere Christian. And on this, her sentence was commuted to 100 lashes, the San Benito garment, and prison for the rest of her life. She died behind bars. Let me finish off by taking the story to regions a little closer to your own country. I mentioned that there really hasn't been enough academic work done on British Inquisition records in New Spain. One reason is that as a community we don't bother. Another reason is that the records are extensive and difficult to work with and often very poorly indexed. Another reason for the complexity is that the Spanish authorities were deeply afraid of Muslims making converts of Native Americans. And they very rapidly, within a few years of Columbus crossing the Atlantic, passed a series of laws that forbid not only Muslims but also Christians of Muslim ancestry from making the journey across the Atlantic. Even if your great-great-great-great-grandfather was a Muslim, you couldn't set sail from Seville and go to Guatemala or wherever. The first of these laws was passed by Ferdinand and Isabella as early as 1501. It says, "No consentiréis ni daréis lugar que hallaba en moros, ni judíos, ni herejes, ni reconciliados, ni personas nuevamente convertidos en vuestra fe." We don't agree and we don't allow it to take place that there should go to that place Moors or Jews or heretics or people reconciled or people recently converted to our faith. That's the first law. Less than 10 years after the so-called discovery of the Americas. In 1513, there's another law that bars the American colonies to anybody who'd ever been condemned for anything by the Inquisition. 1522, Charles V reiterates this with an even stricter law. In 1596, Philip II, in an important letter to his viceroy of New Spain, explicitly urges that extreme measures be taken to preserve the Native Americans from any contact with Muslims. In 1530, the prohibition had been extended even to slaves of Muslim origin, and this becomes quite a burden to the city of Seville, which was then simultaneously the port of embarkation for Mexico and the main slaving city of Iberia. So in 1543, the authorities in the American colonies decreed the expulsion of slaves already in Mexico if they are white slaves, the so-called Berbers, because it was assumed that it was quite likely that they were of Muslim stock. In North America, the authorities seemed so paranoid that they promulgated a document to be read out in every church, warning parishioners of ways in which they might recognize Muslims in their midst. Here is part of that proclamation. Algunas personas han dicho o afirmado que la secta de Mahoma es buena y que no hay otra para entrar en Cristo, no es Dios, sino profeta, que no nació de Nuestra Señora, siendo virgen antes del parto y en el parto y después del parto, o que han hecho algunos ritos y ceremonias de la secta de Mahoma por guardar y observancia de ella, así como si hubiesen guardado los viernes por fiesta, comiendo carne en ellos o en otros días prohibidos por la Santa Madre Iglesia, diciendo que no es pecado, vistiéndose en los dichos viernes camisas limpias y otras ropas de fiesta, etc. Just translate a bit of that. There are people who have said or affirmed that the sect of Muhammad is good and that there is no to see if there's anybody around who has said such a thing. Or somebody who said that Jesus is not God but only a prophet. And that the Virgin Mary was not perpetually a virgin. Or that somebody has been carrying out certain rites or ceremonies of the sect of Muhammad. Or somebody who celebrates Friday as a feast day, eating meat on a Friday, or on other days on which the consumption of meat has been prohibited by Holy Mother Church, saying that this isn't a sin, or wearing clean clothes on Fridays specifically, or other celebratory garments, or que hayan dejado a sus hijos poniéndoles nombres de moros y llamándoles así, o que se llamen nombres de moros, etc. Or if they have secretly given their children names of Moors and call them colloquially by those names, or call themselves by Moorish names, or que hayan dicho que no hay más que Dios y Mahoma su mensajero, etc. It's a very long document. They have said that there is only one God, Muhammad is the messenger. But the church really understands what it's looking for. It's had plenty of experience. This is not the early medieval, extraordinary, erroneous, stereotypical misapprehension of what Islam is. By this time, they really know what they're looking at. So they're paranoid about Islam in the Americas. Nonetheless, a Muslim presence, particularly amongst slaves, is unmistakable. The Inquisition, in particular, is known to have uncovered many slaves who prayed in Muslim fashion while working on the sugar plantations in Cuba. That's in the south. The extent to which Muslims were present on the American mainland remains very obscure. One complication, as Dr. Umar mentioned, is that the term Morisco was conventionally applied to a particular racial type in the highly race-conscious colonial world. It's a very stratified sort of racial consciousness. Someone who was white but had one black grandparent, or Native American grandparent, was known as a Morisco. So in 1696, we find the king himself alarmed by a report showing that one Francisco Castellanos, de Nación Morisco, was living in the district of Tecpatitlan. And the king is so worried that he demands that this man be arrested and deported, and asks to be told everything about him, his date of sailing, his documents, and so forth. And the authorities have to write back to explain that the term Morisco in New Spain is a general term for the son of a Spaniard and what they call mestiza mulata blanca. And so this Castellanos wasn't expelled. Further complication lies in the fact that the Inquisition was so zealous that they would suspect anybody who mentioned anything positive about Islam, even when in a state of intoxication. For instance, one archive record from 1614 indicates that a fisherman of Veracruz had been heard to say, "Bien haya la ley de Mahoma y bien hacen los moros en creer en ella." The law of Muhammad is good, and the Moors do a good thing when they believe in it. And he was drunk, but nonetheless this was regarded as sufficiently outrageous for the Inquisition itself to get involved. Another found a certain Mexican by the name of Simón de Zarate guilty of saying que el día del juicio final había de estar Mahoma a los pies de nuestro Señor oyendo las sentencias contra las almas y las que a Mahoma le pareciesen injustas las había de revocar. They said that on the day of final judgment, Muhammad will be at the feet of our Lord, listening to the sentences passed against the souls, and those which to Muhammad seem to be unjust, he has the right to revoke. Where did he get this idea? Well, the tribunal has extensive documentation and was told that he said that in a book that he called Viaje a Jerusalem, Journey to Jerusalem, he had heard this idea that the Prophet Muhammad could intercede with God. Could this be the Rosales of Al-Ghazali, which mentions the Shaykh, the intercession of the Prophet? Could some copy of that have gone to Mexico? Could it have been preserved orally? We don't know. Or was he just a Christian with distant Muslim ancestors who was modeled up about certain aspects of Christian doctrine? We don't know in that case. However, there are other records that do demonstrate without any doubt that there were actual practicing Muslims in the Americas at this early date. In 15 1560, the city of Cuzco in Peru witnessed the trials of three Moriscos by the names of Luis Solano, Juan Solano, and Mencia, who was a black woman. They were all convicted of having secretly practiced Islam. Again, in the same year, 1560, a certain Alvaro Rosales, originally of a place called Hornachos de Castilla, was condemned for practicing Islam and was turned over to the secular arm to be burnt. Another example was Lope de la Peña of Guadalajara, Mexican Guadalajara, who was convicted of being a Muslim, was condemned to life imprisonment and to perpetually wearing the habit of infamy, the San Benito garment. A more detailed example, this time from the Mexican records, concerns the case of Nicolás de Oliva, interrogated as late as 1611. A number of witnesses are brought to testify that he was originally from Valencia. He mentioned the name of Mahoma in his prayers, he wore Moorish dress at home, and he was circumcised. One more case, this time from the Inquisition of Guadalajara in Mexico. This involved a certain Francisco López, who había cometido delitos contra la fe y invocado el nombre de Mahoma en las oraciones, somebody who committed crimes, sins against the faith, and invoked the name of Muhammad in his prayers. And he appears 6 different times before the Inquisition. And this provides a very detailed picture of rather an adventurous, independent-minded individual who had been discovered in a very remote corner of New Spain by the machinery of the Inquisition. He was a small trader at the mines of a place called Porhala, where he had an illicit affair with the wife of a married Native American man. And it was she who ends up reporting these strange habits to the church authorities. Francisco López, we learn, no era como los otros españoles, porque cuando dormía con ella, después a medianoche, cuando cantaban los gallos, se levantaba de la cama y se hincaba de rodillas y rezaba un rato en una lengua que aunque ella era latina. Francisco López, she says, wasn't like the other Spaniards because whenever he slept with her after midnight, when the birds start to sing, he used to get up and went down and recited something in a language which she thought was Latin. And it seems that Francisco was originally from Ceuta, either of a Muslim or a Christian family who had been attracted to Islam. Another case, definite case, is that of Maria Ruiz, originally of Ciudad Real in Spain, who was picked up by the Inquisition in Mexico. Her parents were Muslims and were among the deportees from the Granada region following the Great Uprising, in which her brothers had actually taken part in. Her family had all been baptized and had attended church but kept Islam in their hearts. Her mother had taught them to pray and fast in a Moorish manner. It seems that she'd been rejected by her family because she married a Christian, an old, real Christian, and he had taken her across the Atlantic. Nonetheless, she had kept up her Muslim practices, although she seemed a bit vague about the dates of Ramadan. She was formally readmitted to the church after being subjected to the confiscation of her property. So clearly, they did get across the Atlantic. The traditional picture that scholars have had, which was that the Iron Curtain established by the Catholic system, which prevented people of even Muslim origin from crossing the ocean to New Spain, doesn't now seem to be sustainable. There are definite indications, irrefutable proof that Muslims were picked up and tried by the Inquisition in various parts of the New World in the 16th and 17th century. It's now established beyond any shadow of doubt. How did they get there? And why did they go to Mexico rather than to the Muslim world when it was a short hop across to North Africa? Why go to Yucatan? Well, firstly, how did they get there? It's known that in Seville there was a roaring trade in forged genealogical documents. In Spain, as in Nazi Germany, it was required for certain legal processes to have your family tree that showed that you were of clean blood, that you didn't have Jews or Muslims in your ancestry. You had to present this if you were to be allowed on the galleon that would take you to New Spain. But these documents could be forged and were bought and sold as they were in the time of the Nazi Holocaust, and of course many Jews were saved by getting hold of these iron pass things, these certificate of Aryan ancestry. It's a very similar idea. going to a place in North Africa where they'd have to learn a new language and new customs and experience actually a greater degree of culture shock. There are other reasons. New Spain offered immense commercial opportunities. It was a place where you could, as a young man, make a fortune. Also, it was enormous and poorly policed. It was easier to get away from the church in remote areas of, say, New Mexico than it was if you were in Spain, which was under the constant surveillance of a hugely sophisticated, well-developed and ubiquitous inquisitorial spider that had its extensions in every village. Anyway, I should stop now because John will make another and I just say, since I shall be leaving you this evening, I'm not coming back to Granada with you, I'm very grateful to the faculty, the Facultad de Estudios Andalusis, for hosting us in this unique space, and I've spoken in many places around the world. This has to be one of the most spectacular, most wonderful, and the most blessed as well. I think many of us, as we stepped into the mosque this afternoon, felt for the first time in 10 days we were stepping into a place that was really peaceful, was unambiguously Islamic, that was in a place of fitra and sincerity and mutual love amongst Muslims. And that is a testimony to the sincerity of the man who has brought this about, Shaykh Abdul. It is not a little thing to buck the trend both of Spanish history and of the current state of the world to establish a citadel for the propagation of normal Islam on a hilltop in this historically enormously tense and significant place. And they say that Taysir alamat al-idn, that facilitation is a sign of divine permission. And it's no little thing that Shaykh Abdul, his family, and those who work with him have been given this permission by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a time when clearly so many other Islamic activities are not being given and they end in discourse and catastrophe. And inshallah we'll remember him in our prayers. I'd like also to thank the Nawawi Foundation for its immense hospitality in allowing me to tag along. And if I could just, as somebody who's not in any way part of the Nawawi Foundation, state my own belief that as somebody who travels extensively and meets every manner of Muslim operation and organisation and masjid and foundation and this and that, and we have this huge concatenation of organisations